Where's the master bedroom? We'll need it tonight. My sister said this in front of 40 of my guests, rolling 2 suitcases behind her like she was checking into a hotel. I smiled, refilled my wine glass and said, "Let me show you the guest room instead." She had no idea I'd already called a locksmith. If you like stories like this, quiet people who finally stop being quiet, hit subscribe now. You will not want to miss how this one ends. My name is Renee Castillo. I'm 33 years old, and 11 weeks ago, I closed on a 5-bedroom house on Larkspur Court, the first thing I have ever owned outright in my life. I grew up the second daughter in a family that never pretended to be fair. My younger sister, Paige, is 29, and from the time she was 6 years old, she was the daughter my parents built their world around. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it because it's simply true. And the truth is the only thing that ever mattered in our house. My parents, Diane and Walter, paid Paige's full tuition at a private university, $96,000 over 4 years, without blinking. They rented her a 1-bedroom apartment near campus for $1,400 a month, so she wouldn't have to deal with roommates. When she got married to a man named Marcus 6 years ago, my parents spent $34,000 on the wedding. A number I know exactly because my mother mentioned it, more than once, like a receipt she wanted me to see. I started working at 15, bagging groceries at a store 2 miles from our house, riding my bike there in the rain because my parents said gas money wasn't in the budget for me, though it apparently was for Paige's Honda Civic 2 years later. I taught myself basic coding at 17 because a boy in my computer class showed me how. And by 19 I was building small websites for local businesses for $200 a project. When I got into college, a state school 3 hours away, my parents told me flatly they couldn't help. I paid for it myself, in installments, working 2 jobs on top of a full course load. I told myself it wasn't a competition. I told myself that for almost 15 years. There were smaller moments too, the kind that add up quietly until one day you realize you've been keeping a ledger without meaning to. Paige got a new car for her 22nd birthday. A silver Civic with a bow on it in our parents' driveway. I got a card. When I made the dean's list 2 semesters in a row, my mother said that's nice, and changed the subject to Paige's internship at a marketing firm she'd gotten through a family friend. When Paige struggled in her first job and quit after 4 months, my parents called it finding herself. When I got laid off once, briefly, at 26, during a round of company-wide cuts that had nothing to do with my performance, my father's first question was what I'd done wrong to deserve it. Even the holidays had a rhythm to them that I only noticed once I was old enough to name it. Every Thanksgiving, Paige got to sit next to my mother and help with the cooking, while I was handed the folding chairs and the extra leaf for the table, like the labor was simply assumed to be mine. Every Christmas, there was always one gift under the tree that was clearly bigger, clearly more expensive, and it was never mine. I stopped keeping track of the specific gifts around 24. I never stopped noticing the pattern. I coped the way a lot of people cope. I told myself it was temporary, that eventually my parents would see what I'd built without them. I told myself the imbalance would even out, that hard work was its own quiet argument, and eventually someone would notice the math. It never did even out. It just got quieter, and I got better at not mentioning it. Better at smiling through Thanksgiving dinners and telling myself that keeping the peace was its own kind of achievement. By 30, I was a marketing director at a healthcare software company, making more in a year than my parents made in 3. I saved almost everything for 4 years. I ate at home. I drove a 2014 Corolla with 140,000 miles on it. I didn't take a real vacation from 2021 to 2024. And this past spring, I bought the house on Larkspur Court for $412,000, all from money I earned myself. My parents came to see it exactly once, a week after I closed. They walked through the living room, the kitchen with the island I'd wanted since I was a kid, clipping pictures out of magazines, the backyard with the maple tree already turning red. My mother's only comment was, "This is an awful lot of space for one person." My father asked how much the mortgage was, then said nothing when I told him there wasn't one. Paige didn't come at all. She said she wasn't feeling well. I found out later she'd gone to brunch that morning with 2 friends, 12 minutes from my new front door. I decided not to let that sting. I planned a housewarming party for 3 weeks later. 40 guests, string lights in the backyard, a caterer I'd found on Instagram who did small plates. I invited my parents. I invited Paige and Marcus. I told myself, one more chance. The party started at 6 p.m. on a Saturday in April. My coworkers came. College friends I hadn't seen in years came. My Aunt Carol came early to help me set up the folding tables, and my cousin Faith brought her twin daughters, who spent the whole night chasing fireflies in the backyard. It was, for about 90 minutes, the best night of my adult life. Then at 7:40 my mother texted, "Your father's blood pressure is acting up again. We're going to sit this one out. Sorry, honey." I read it standing by the dessert table, and felt the same familiar drop in my stomach I'd felt my entire childhood. I put my phone away and kept smiling. I was getting good at that. At 8:15, my front door opened without a knock. Paige walked in first, in a dress that looked new, dragging a hardshell suitcase behind her. Marcus followed with 2 duffel bags and a box of what I'd later learn was her entire skincare collection. "There you are," Paige said, like she was the one who'd been waiting. "Where's the master bedroom? We need to get settled before it gets late." I laughed, actually laughed, thinking it was some strange joke. Settled for what? "Mom talked to you about this, right? We're staying with you. Our lease fell through." She said it the way you'd mention the weather. Nobody talked to me about anything. "Renee, don't make this weird in front of your friends." She was already scanning the staircase. Marcus, to his credit, looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. I stepped outside onto my own porch and called my mother. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice bright, like she wasn't the one who'd engineered an ambush at my housewarming party. "Mom, Paige just showed up with luggage. What is going on?" "Renee, please don't make a scene. It's just temporary. You have all that space." That sentence, "you have all that space," has stayed with me every day since. As if the size of my house made it communal property. As if the years I'd spent building it made it fair game for someone who'd never once had to build anything for herself. "This is my house, Mom. Nobody asked me." "I'm asking you now. Be reasonable, Renee. She's your sister." I hung up. I went back inside, past a room full of people who were starting to sense something was wrong, and found Paige already upstairs, unzipping her suitcase on my bed. The bed I'd bought myself 6 weeks earlier. The first brand new mattress I'd ever owned in my life. "You're not staying here," I told her, calm, quiet, the caterer's soft jazz still drifting up the stairwell. "Where else are we supposed to go?" Mom said. I don't care what Mom said. I care what I said, and I never said yes. She looked at me like I'd slapped her. "Wow. Real family, huh?" "Real family asks before they unpack in someone else's bedroom, Paige. You're being dramatic. It's not like you're using all 5 bedrooms right now anyway." "That's not the point, and you know it isn't." "It's exactly the point. You've always had more than you needed and acted like sharing it was some kind of sacrifice." Her voice had climbed loud enough that I could hear the party downstairs go quiet for a second. The way a room does when it senses something is happening just out of view. "I earned every square foot of this house myself, Paige. Nobody gave it to me. And nobody gave me anything either, apparently, according to you. Must be nice to rewrite your whole childhood. So you come out the hero." I didn't answer that one. There wasn't a version of that fight I was going to win in a doorway, at my own party, with 40 people downstairs pretending not to listen. I told her we'd talk about it in the morning, and I went back down to my guests, my face arranged into something that could pass, from a distance, for calm. "I want to tell you what most people don't know about me, something even my parents never fully understood. 2 years before I bought this house, my grandfather, my mother's father, a quiet man named Otto who ran a hardware store for 40 years, passed away and left a trust behind, split between his 2 grandchildren. He didn't leave it to my parents. He left it to Paige and me, directly, with my father named as the administrator only because I was the one at 31, who was already handling my own finances well enough that the estate lawyer suggested making it official. What that meant practically was this. For 18 months, I had been the one quietly approving disbursements from that trust, including the $2,300 a month that had been covering the difference between what my parents could actually afford and the mortgage they were still paying on their own house. A fact they believed was simply a good refinance rate their bank had offered them out of nowhere. They had no idea where that money truly came from. They had no idea I was the one signing off on it every single month. I never told anyone, including Paige, because I didn't want to be thanked for something that had never been my idea in the first place. I just kept doing it quietly, because they were still my parents. Before I tell you what I did next, make sure you're subscribed, because this is the part they never saw coming. I went back downstairs, smiled through the rest of my own party like nothing had happened, and said goodnight to my last guests around midnight. Paige and Marcus had gone to bed in my guest room by then, having apparently decided the master bedroom battle could wait until morning. At 6:45 a.m., before either of them woke up, I called my boss and asked for a personal day. Then I called the trust's administrator, a woman named Sylvia who had handled Grandpa Otto's estate for years, and I asked her to formally suspend the monthly disbursement to my parents' mortgage account, effective immediately, citing reassessment of trust obligations. Language Sylvia herself suggested, calm and clinical, exactly the tone this required. I wasn't cutting my parents off out of spite. I was simply no longer willing to quietly fund a household that had just tried to install itself, uninvited, in mine. Next, I called a locksmith. By 9 a.m., every lock in my house had been changed, front door, back door, even the side gate. I packed Paige and Marcus's belongings myself, every folded shirt, every bottle from that skincare box, back into their own suitcases, and I called a courier service to deliver them to my parents' address, for miles away. I taped a note to the largest suitcase. It read, "Don't make a scene. Renee." When Paige and Marcus came downstairs around 10, ready to head to work, they found an empty guest room and a locked front door. I know this because Marcus texted me, "Oh, we can't get back in?" I didn't answer. I was already at the courier's warehouse, watching a man load 2 suitcases and a box of serums into a delivery van. By that evening, my phone would not stop ringing. My mother called 11 times that first day. I let everyone go to voicemail. Around 6 p.m. the text started, and I want to read you exactly what they said because I've kept every one of them. "Renee, how could you humiliate your sister like this? Your father is beside himself. This is not who we raised you to be. You have always been jealous of Paige and this proves it." I typed one reply and only one. I raised myself mostly. And no. "I'm exhausted." Paige called next, and when I finally picked up on the 9th attempt, she was already yelling before I said hello. "What is wrong with you? We had nowhere else to go. You could have just let us stay a few weeks. You didn't ask me. You told my guests you were moving in. You unpacked in my bedroom. So you locked us out like criminals? Changed the locks? That's insane, Renee, even for you. I think it's the first time in my life I've done something completely sane," I said. "You'll be fine at Mom and Dad's. You've had a lot of practice landing softly." She hung up on me. I remember standing in my own kitchen, the one with the island I dreamed about since I was 14, and feeling something I hadn't felt in years, still. Not angry, not guilty, just still. Marcus texted me separately that same night, almost apologetic. For what it's worth, I told her this was a bad idea. She said your mom promised it would be fine. I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to believe him. Another part of me had learned, over 33 years, that being the reluctant bystander to someone else's entitlement still makes you a participant in it. 3 days later, my father called from a number I didn't recognize, probably borrowing a coworker's phone since I'd blocked his. "Renee, your mother is devastated. Family helps family. You have 5 bedrooms and 1 person living in the house. Dad, I bought this house with money I earned. I didn't ask you to help pay for it, and I'm not going to let anyone move into it without asking either. That's not family. That's an invasion with a suitcase." He was quiet for a second. Then he said something I'll never forget. "You've always made things difficult, Renee. You've always had to prove a point." I told him calmly that the only point I was proving was that I existed too. Then I ended the call. 2 weeks after that, a letter arrived from a lawyer I'd never heard of, retained by my parents. It stated they were considering legal action, demanding I either allow Paige to reside in the house or reimburse them $31,000. The amount they claimed they'd spent on my college tuition, though I had paid for every dollar of it myself. I sat at my kitchen island reading it twice, my hands actually shaking, not from fear but from disbelief. My own parents threatening to sue me over money that was never theirs to begin with. That night, my cousin Faith stopped by with a bottle of wine and sat with me on the back porch while the fireflies came out again. "You did the right thing," she said. "Everyone at that party saw exactly what happened. Nobody thinks you were the villain here." I hired a lawyer of my own the next morning, a woman named Priya who read the letter, then looked at me and laughed, not unkindly, but with the particular disbelief of someone who has seen a lot of family disputes and still finds some of them absurd. "They have no case," she said. "There's no loan agreement, no promissory note, nothing that turns a tuition gift into a debt decades later. And there is absolutely no legal obligation for you to house an adult sibling in a home you own outright." She drafted a response in 4 days flat, closing with a line I've since had printed and framed in my office. "Generosity does not create a lien." I never heard from that lawyer again. But my mother did try one more thing. A month later, Aunt Carol called to tell me my parents had started telling relatives a different story, that I'd invited Paige to move in, then thrown her out over some jealousy thing about Marcus. A claim so absurd and so specific it took my breath away. I sent my mother one message, on a group thread where 3 other relatives could see it. "If you keep telling people lies about me and Marcus, I will pursue this as slander, and I have already spoken with a lawyer about what that looks like. Retract it, or I will." 2 days later, at a family dinner I wasn't at, my mother admitted, in front of my aunt and uncle and 2 cousins, that she'd made the story up out of anger. Most of the family stopped speaking to her for a while after that. I found out about the whole thing secondhand, the way I've found out about most things in my family for years. The months after that were the quietest, fullest months of my life. Without the constant undertow of managing my parents' expectations, I threw myself into my work and landed a promotion to senior director by August. A raise that let me finally landscape the backyard the way I'd pictured it the day I first walked through the house. I started seeing someone, a structural engineer named Julian, who heard the whole story over dinner one night and simply said, "That's not normal, you know. None of that is normal." Something about hearing it from someone outside my family, plainly, without excuses, gave me permission to finally believe it myself. By the following spring, my parents had stopped helping Paige and Marcus financially altogether, a boundary they suddenly discovered 11 months after refusing to respect mine. I ran into Marcus at a grocery store that same spring, both of us reaching for the same brand of coffee, and the encounter turned out to be more honest than any conversation I'd had with my sister in years. "For what it's worth," he said, "moving into your house wasn't my idea. I want you to know that. I thought it was wrong the second Paige brought it up, but she said your mom had already cleared it, and I didn't want to fight both of them at once." I asked him why he hadn't said something to me directly, back at the party. He looked down at the coffee in his hands for a second before answering. "Because Paige would have made my life miserable for weeks. She really believed you owed her that house, Renee. She said our parents had always favored you less financially early on, so it was only fair you evened it out for her now that you could." I told him that isn't how fairness works, that you don't get to appoint yourself the beneficiary of someone else's discipline. He nodded slowly. "I know that now," he said. "We're doing okay on our own. It's been hard, but we're managing." Paige and Marcus separated that summer. I heard through my aunt that a lot of what came out during their split involved how Paige had never actually planned to leave my house at all. She'd told Marcus, privately, that if she could just establish herself there for a few months, it would be harder for Renee to kick us out. Something about residency, about how much messier it would look for me to remove her once mail started arriving there in her name. My mother had known the whole plan and backed it anyway. A letter arrived from my mother 8 months after the party, 3 pages long, starting with something that resembled an apology and ending, predictably, with a request for money, since they were struggling a bit. Without the mortgage help they never knew I'd been the one providing. I read it once, then fed it through my shredder. Aunt Carol still calls me every few weeks with updates I never ask for but never quite tell her to stop giving either. "Your parents are still telling relatives you'll come around eventually," she said the last time we spoke. "They keep asking people to talk to you." I asked her what she tells them. That you're doing better than fine, she said. And that if they actually want a relationship with you, it starts with an apology, not a phone tree. Paige, from what I understand, is still in that same small apartment, still telling anyone who'll listen that the house should have been split fairly between us. As though a house I paid for with a decade of overtime and skipped vacations was ever a joint asset to begin with. Some people mistake other people's discipline for luck, and no amount of evidence ever seems to correct that particular math. I still think about my grandfather sometimes, Otto, who spent 40 years running a hardware store and somehow understood, better than either of his own children, that fairness has to be built on purpose. It doesn't happen by accident, and it definitely doesn't happen by guilt. He split that trust evenly between two granddaughters because he believed correctly that love isn't something you ration to the child who asks for it loudest. If there's one thing I'd want anyone hearing this to take with them, it's this: being generous with people who love you is not the same as being available to people who simply expect you to be. The difference between those two things is the whole reason my house is still standing. Locks changed mine exactly as I built it. I got married to Julian last spring, in that same backyard, under the maple tree that had just started turning red again. My mother and father weren't there. Paige wasn't either. My guest list had 42 people on it, and every single one of them had shown up for me on purpose, not out of obligation. Aunt Carol gave a toast that made half the yard cry, mostly about how family isn't the people who share your blood. It's the people who show up without being asked to prove anything first. I don't know if my parents will ever really understand what they lost that night at my housewarming party. I used to wonder about that constantly. I don't anymore. I built a life quietly on my own terms, out of a house they once called an awful lot of space for one person. Turns out it was exactly enough space, just not for the people who thought they were entitled to it. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And tell me in the comments what you would have done the moment you saw those suitcases in your own doorway.